If you're considering separation, I'm open to it, but I want to stay with our son." After an intense argument, Richard seemed relieved as he took a deep breath, leaving me searching for the right comeback. Our son, who had been quietly observing, stepped in to clarify that the person Richard was defending was, in fact, his mistress. Our son's blunt words brought a mischievous smile to my face. "My name is Cynthia, and I'm a 39-year-old freelance graphics designer. I balance my career with household duties and raising our son, who's now in 7th grade. For the past 12 years of marriage, Richard has hopped from two jobs to another without much stability, relying heavily on my income to support our family. Despite the challenges, I've managed to provide a steady income through my freelance work, which has grown thanks to recommendations from past clients. I'm now tasked with creating graphic designers for educational materials, and as our son Stephen becomes more independent, I'm able to dedicate more time to work both from home and outside. Our family dynamics have been mostly peaceful, but Richard's lack of ambition and contribution to household responsibilities has been a growing concern. At 41, he seldom works full-time or assists with chores and parenting, a pattern that has persisted throughout our marriage. This neglect extends to Stephen, who's navigating the tricky teenage years. Despite his quiet demeanor, Stephen often helps around the house, likely emulating the work ethic he's seen in me since he was young. Richard's recent behavior, including coming home late without clear reasons, has heightened my suspicions and frustration. Despite his disinterest in parenting, he's suddenly eager to drive Stephen to his volleyball club, a task that seems out of character given his usual indifference. This change, amidst the backdrop of our marital challenges, raises questions about his motives and our family's future. In summary, amidst the struggles of balancing work, household duties, and raising a son, the stability of our family is threatened by Richard's actions and lack of engagement. As we navigate these challenges, the importance of communication, trust, and mutual support becomes increasingly evident. I've always managed to fit the school drop-offs and pickups into my busy schedule, but recently Richard started volunteering for this task. While I appreciated the help, something about it didn't sit right with me. My suspicions were inadvertently confirmed during an unexpected encounter. After a shopping trip, I took a detour and passed by the volleyball club where my son Stephen goes. There, I saw Richard engaged in a cheerful conversation with a woman who appeared to work at the facility. This was surprising because Richard had told me he would be out of town for work. I approached them, and the woman, noticing me, called out, asking if I was Stephen's mother. I acknowledged, feeling a bit awkward as I didn't fully recognize her despite her familiar face from previous drop-offs. The woman introduced herself as Emma, but oddly, she didn't mention her role at the club. My husband, looking tense, quickly wrapped up their conversation. The ride home was silent, with Richard avoiding eye contact and seeming distant, a stark contrast to how engaged he had been with Emma. His recent pattern of late nights and his newfound enthusiasm for driving Stephen, coupled with this encounter, led me to suspect an affair. This suspicion deepened when Emma started visiting our home under the guise of checking on Stephen, but her timing always coincided with Richard being there. Their easy conversations and her frequent visits felt like more than just coincidences. Despite her claims of concern for our son, it was clear her visits were aimed at spending time with Richard. I began to notice more signs of Richard's distance from me since he started taking over the drop-offs and pickups. When I tried to discuss his behavior with our son, he responded curtly, clearly bothered by his father's insistence on driving him daily. This unnatural insistence on Richard's part started to raise more red flags for me. Emma's increasing presence in our home, always during times when Richard was present, confirmed my growing suspicions. Watching them interact with ease in our living room, it became evident that her involvement in our lives was not just about our son. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, pointing towards the uncomfortable truth of Richard's infidelity. A month into noticing unusual patterns in my husband Richard's behavior, my suspicions about his fidelity grew. Richard began returning home increasingly late and sometimes would be away for days. One evening, after he sneaked in late again, I half-jokingly accused him of cheating, trying to lighten the mood. His reaction, however, was anything but light. He stood up abruptly, glaring at me, and retorted that he was taking care of Stephen, our son, and that I should not meddle unnecessarily. His defensive response only fueled my suspicions further. The tension in our home escalated. Stephen, who usually stayed out of our disputes, approached me one night with concern. He hesitantly mentioned Emma, a staff member from his volleyball club, who he suspected might be involved with Richard. Stephen expressed his discomfort with how clingy Emma was at the club, and he was even more disturbed that she frequented our house. This confirmed my unease wasn't unfounded, and it was a relief to know Stephen shared my sentiments, even though it did little to solve the underlying issue. One day, returning from a meeting with a client, I was greeted by the sound of laughter and conversation from the living room. It was Richard and Emma, engaging as if our home was their haven, with no sign of Stephen joining in. Upon my entrance, Richard appeared uneasy, while Emma greeted me with a bold smile, casually mentioning Richard had invited her over. Her familiarity with Richard, addressing him by his first name and her presence in our home, intensified my discomfort. When I commented on her frequent visits despite her busy work schedule, she responded smugly that it was part of her job. This assertion left me baffled and even more suspicious. Her confidence and the nonchalant way she inserted herself into our lives suggested there was more to her relationship with Richard than mere professional or casual acquaintance. The situation at home, with its undercurrents of tension and unsaid accusations, had become a complex web of emotions and suspicions, affecting not just the adults involved but our son Stephen as well. The audacity of Emma making herself so comfortable in our home irked me. She casually critiqued the homeliness of our house, implying it wasn't cleaned meticulously, all while wearing a smug smile. Her comments were a thinly veiled jab at my housekeeping, suggesting that although our home had a cozy vibe, it hinted at my supposed negligence. To my dismay, Richard didn't defend me, but rather agreed with her, laughing off her remarks. Despite my efforts to balance work from home with household chores, Richard's lack of assistance made it challenging to maintain everything perfectly. Feeling mocked and sidelined in my own home, the atmosphere became unbearable, driving me to retreat to the bedroom, overwhelmed by frustration, sadness, and a sense of humiliation. The fear that Emma might usurp my role within the family loomed over me. Yet I hesitated to confront her directly, cautious of the potential impact on my son and his connections to the volleyball team. Richard and Emma's blatant display of their relationship, under the guise of discussing my son's educational needs, felt like a direct taunt. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to document evidence of Richard's infidelity. The discovery of receipts for extravagant expenses on motels, fine dining, and luxury items, luxuries he claimed we couldn't afford, was a painful confirmation of his betrayal. Despite the heartache, I meticulously collected proof of his affairs, contemplating divorce yet resolved to wait for the sake of our son Stephen's stability until he finished high school. The financial implications of Richard's actions puzzled me. Even with his salary, the lavish spending seemed unsustainable. My concerns deepened as I pondered the source of these funds. Then, a chilling realization struck me. We had a savings account designated for Stephen's college fund. The thought of Richard potentially dipping into our son's future savings filled me with dread, prompting a rush of anxiety and fear for what I might find. I hurried to review the transactions of our son's education savings account, only to discover that significant sums had been withdrawn multiple times in recent months. This account, which I had set up to safeguard my son's future, showed a substantial decrease in funds. Despite keeping a tight leash on our credit card spending and monthly expenses, I hadn't checked this particular account regularly. The shock of this discovery sent shivers down my spine, and I struggled to calm my trembling hands. The harsh reality hit me. The funds I had diligently saved for our son's education were being squandered on my husband's affair. At that moment, the identity of the other woman became irrelevant. The unforgivable part was not the infidelity itself, but the misuse of our child's future resources for selfish indulgences. This betrayal was not just against me as his spouse, but more grievously against our son. I asked my fury and continued to pretend that everything was normal, keen on shielding our son, who was in his crucial years of growth and education, from any distress. The burden of keeping the family's turmoil under wraps while managing my responsibilities led to slip-ups in my daily tasks and professional duties. Even Mrs. Alexis, a long-standing client, noticed my distressed state and offered her support, which, while embarrassing, provided a glimmer of comfort amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, my husband seemed increasingly carefree, evidently enjoying his time with his mistress more openly. It was only a matter of time before Stephen, our son, became aware of the family's predicaments. One day he quietly joined me to fold laundry, offering support in his own reserved way. His insight into the situation, despite his few words, brought a mix of warmth and renewed anger towards the person jeopardizing our son's financial security. The need for action against this betrayal grew stronger. I contemplated seeking help from someone who had once promised their unwavering support, feeling a surge of determination to address the wrongs inflicted by my husband and his paramour. The situation took another turn when my husband announced an unexpected 2-week-long absence for a supposed work-related training program in another state. This development left me pondering the next steps in confronting the financial and emotional betrayal within our family. I had my doubts about my husband's supposed work trip. The restaurant chain he worked for didn't operate beyond our state borders, and he had once bragged about the job not requiring out-of-state relocation. When he mentioned this training program, both my son and I were skeptical, though we didn't openly challenge his claim. My son, with a hint of sarcasm, mentioned to his father that a staff member from his volleyball club, coincidentally Emma, was also taking 3 weeks off. He mused about the rarity of taking such a vacation without significant savings, which visibly unsettled my husband. His sudden silence and nervous glances at his smartphone were telltale signs of his deceit. Aware of my husband's affair, I had been monitoring him and Emma closely, even hiring a private investigator who confirmed that Emma was indeed planning to take the same time off. It was clear to me that this business trip was a facade for a romantic escape. Rather than confronting them immediately, I had a different strategy in mind, one that required my son's approval. After bidding my husband a seemingly cheerful farewell, my son and I, with the help of relatives who were both upset by my husband's actions and supportive of us, began a thorough house cleaning and started packing our belongings. Our plan was to leave the house during his absence and temporarily stay with relatives until we could secure a new place. Our family, understanding our predicament, generously opened their home to us. To safeguard our financial future, I transferred the remaining funds from the joint savings account to a personal account I controlled. As we prepared to leave, I noticed my husband's belongings scattered around, a stark reminder of the life we were leaving behind. This move wasn't just about finding a new home, it was about reclaiming our dignity and starting anew, away from the deceit that had marred our family life. In the midst of moving out, I couldn't bear to just abandon my husband's possessions. After some consideration, I arranged for his items to be sent to a specific location, with Mrs. Alexis's approval. As the pickup service took away the boxes, my son and I looked around our now orderly house, sharing a moment of contentment. A few days into our stay with relatives, I was jolted by my phone suddenly ringing. The sight of my husband's name as the caller prompted a resigned sigh from me. His voice, laced with panic, pleaded for money, claiming he had run out during his training. His desperation was palpable, likely exacerbated by the embarrassment of facing financial difficulties in front of Emma. I couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and vindication as I refused his request, suggesting sarcastically that he use the account he had been depleting. His reaction was to yell, but I didn't give in, coolly reminding him that he'd manage without the extra funds. The unexpected interjection of Emma's frantic voice in the background prompted a swift end to the call from his side. The following day, my son and I arrived at a grand mansion, the home of Mrs. Alexis, where we found my husband and Emma in a rather compromising situation. My husband, looking defeated, was on the floor apologizing profusely, not to me, but to Mrs. Alexis. It turned out Emma, caught in the act, was actually Mrs. Alexis's daughter. She had been forced to cut her trip short and face her parents after a mysterious package arrived for her at their home. Mrs. Alexis, stern and disappointed, confronted the situation head-on. Despite my husband's apologies, it was Mrs. Alexis who felt the need to apologize for the chaos caused by her daughter. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Emma's escapade with my husband had unwittingly brought her back to face the consequences of her actions under her mother's roof. This twist of fate underscored the tangled web of personal and professional lives, binding us together in an unexpected confrontation. Upon Mrs. Alexis's firm command, Richard, my husband, visibly trembled with fear. Mrs. Alexis had been a pillar of support ever since I disclosed Richard's affair and the identity of his mistress, her own daughter Emma, leaving her deeply upset but determined to rectify the situation. She had since been an unwavering ally, expressing her sincere apologies for the turmoil caused by her daughter's reckless actions. In front of the collected boxes, evidence of Emma's indiscretion, Mrs. Alexis chastised her, highlighting the shame brought upon their family. Emma's attempts to deflect blame and drag Richard into her defense fell flat, especially under my stern gaze, which silenced any excuses he might have had. Emma's admission of ignorance about her mother's connection to me only emphasized her desperation to keep her affair hidden from Mrs. Alexis, known for her strong ethical standards. Mrs. Alexis's resolve to see her daughter make amends, regardless of the time it would take, was clear. She insisted on an apology, declaring her intention to hold Emma accountable for her actions. Amidst Emma's dramatic protests, I focused my attention on Richard, demanding he address the situation. Surprisingly, he began to criticize me, praising Emma's qualities and suggesting that she would be a better partner and mother, even proposing that he should raise our son with her. Stephen, having witnessed enough, intervened. He clarified that Emma was merely an intern at the club, diminishing the image Richard tried to build up of her. He also firmly told Richard not to expect any familial bond with him, criticizing Emma's inappropriate behavior. This confrontation laid bare the deep fractures within our family, propelled by Richard's betrayal and Emma's involvement. Mrs. Alexis's stance not only emphasized the consequences of their actions, but also highlighted the solidarity between those wronged by this affair, setting the stage for a significant upheaval in our lives. As my son pointed out, Emma was never formally employed at the volleyball club, which debunked my husband Richard's claims of her being deeply involved and experienced in educational activities. It was clear they both had been living a lie. Facing Emma's bewildered expression, I felt compelled to enlighten her about the real financial dynamics of our household. I explained how I had been the one covering all expenses, including rent, living costs, and even Stephen's tuition fees, revealing Richard's minimal contribution and his facade of financial stability. Emma, overwhelmed by the truth, was visibly shaken, a stark contrast to Richard's attempt to maintain his pride. This revelation seemed to dismantle the image Richard had constructed, exposing him not as the provider he pretended to be, but rather as someone dependent on my earnings. In the aftermath, Richard and Emma were ousted from Mrs. Alexis's home, a clear sign of their fall from grace. Following Mrs. Alexis's counsel, I engaged a skilled lawyer to navigate the divorce, streamlining the process and ensuring a fair settlement, including securing Stephen's education fund as part of child support. The fallout of their actions was swift. Emma faced repercussions at the volleyball club for her involvement with a married parent, leading to her dismissal. Alienated from her family and criticized for her choices, Emma found herself isolated. Meanwhile, Richard's attempts at reconciliation were futile. Stephen and I were resolute in moving forward without him. Mrs. Alexis, burdened with guilt over her daughter's role in the upheaval, received my reassurance. Our bond, strengthened through adversity, led to new beginnings, including a promising job opportunity for me. This turn of events allowed me to focus on my career and our life ahead with Stephen, who expressed his pride in my work and the life we were rebuilding together. Amidst these challenges, the support and affirmation from my son were invaluable. Stephen's appreciation for my efforts as a mother and a graphics designer was a profound source of motivation. As I continued my work, the resolve to provide a stable and hopeful future for Stephen was my driving force, reinforced by the love and respect we shared.